This is a fictional, dramatized story inspired by real emotions, and every character and event here is imagined.
The first thing I noticed wasn't my parents' car in my driveway. It was the envelope on my kitchen table, still half open, like it had been waiting for me to look at it twice. Hillsborough County. Property tax reassessment. I'd been staring at medical billing codes all morning, the kind of work that makes your eyes go soft around the edges. So at first I thought the number was just another line I'd misread. Then I saw the assessed value again. Land. Not the house. Land. It had jumped so high it made my throat tighten. I set my glass of iced tea down too hard and watched a little ring of water spread across the paper. I told myself there had to be a mistake. The way you do when something threatens the one quiet thing you finally built for yourself. Then I heard tires on gravel, a car door, another. I didn't rush to the window. I didn't need to. My parents never showed up unannounced unless they were already rehearsing what they planned to say. When I opened the door, my mother stepped inside first, not looking at my face, but scanning the living room the way people do at an open house. My father followed her, quiet, hands in his pockets, eyes drifting anywhere except mine. They hadn't been here in months, not when I replaced the roof, not when I spent a weekend ripping out moldy drywall with my own hands, not when I planted the little garden that finally made the backyard feel like mine. My mother walked straight past the couch and stopped at the window. She stared out at the street, at the fresh paint on the porch railing, at the neighbor's new fence down the block. Then she turned back to me and asked, almost casually, "So what are houses on this street going for now?" That was the moment the reassessment letter stopped feeling like paperwork and started feeling like a flare. I could hear my sister Brooke's voice in my head, the one my parents always defended. Brooke, who got the condo with the pool and the security gate in 2019. Brooke, who called my place a fixer-upper, as if it were a personality flaw. Brooke, who never had to learn what it meant to live with a bucket under a leak. My mother's eyes moved again, counting, measuring, deciding. She nodded once, like she'd confirmed something she already suspected. Then she said, "We need to talk about this house." And my father, still not meeting my eyes, added softly, "It's only fair we rebalance things. If you've ever had family treat your life like an asset, you'll understand what happened next." In 2019, my parents called Brooke and me into the living room like they were announcing a holiday trip. My mother had her hands folded in her lap, smiling the way she did when she wanted credit for being generous. My father stood near the fireplace, nodding along before anyone had even spoken. Brooke sat on the couch, scrolling on her phone, polished and unbothered, like whatever happened next would land in her favor either way. I remember standing by the doorway, already bracing myself, because in our family, good news was never shared without a comparison attached to it. My dad cleared his throat and said they had decided to help both of their daughters get a proper start. He said it like he was proud of the fairness of it. My mother added that they wanted to do something meaningful, something that would set us up for the future. Then she turned to Brooke first. She said they had bought her a condo, downtown, new building, security gate, pool, a gym. The kind of place you see in ads where people carry grocery bags that somehow never look heavy. Brooke finally looked up and smiled, already imagining herself there. My mother reached into a folder and slid a glossy printout across the coffee table, like it was a trophy. Then my mother turned to me, and for a brief second, I felt something like hope. She said they had a house for me. A house. The word sounded big, permanent, equal, maybe, I thought. For one stupid heartbeat, that this time they had finally seen me. Then she handed me the address and the photos. The house looked abandoned. The windows were cracked. The roof sagged. The front yard was a mess of weeds and dead branches. The siding had peeled back in places, like it was trying to escape. My mother didn't even pause to let the disappointment register. She started explaining right away. She said it had potential. She said I was practical. She said I could handle it. Good. She said Brooke needed something safe and ready. And that was why the condo made more sense for her. My father nodded, like this was a sensible business decision, not a family choice. I wanted to ask why safety was always her right, and struggle was always my assignment. I wanted to say I worked just as hard, that I never asked for less. But years of being the reasonable one kicked in, and my mouth did what it always did. I smiled. I thanked them. I told them it was a generous gift. And when my mother squeezed my hand and said, "See, this is why we can count on you," something inside me quietly folded in on itself. I moved in at the end of September, when Tampa was still hot enough to make the air feel thick. The first night, I slept on an old mattress on the living room floor because the bedroom smelled like damp wood and something sour I couldn't name. The house creaked every time the wind shifted. Not in a charming way, but like it was warning me that nothing in it was stable. I found a bucket in the garage and set it under a stain in the ceiling without even thinking, the way you do when you've already accepted you're going to be the one managing the mess. By the second day, I realized the heater didn't work, even though it wasn't cold yet, and half the outlets sparked if I plugged in anything heavier than a lamp. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily, like a metronome keeping time with my disappointment. I kept telling myself it was still mine. That word became my only comfort. Mine. No rent. No landlord. No one to answer to. But every time I said it in my head, I also heard my mother's voice right behind it. Practical. Potential. Handle it. The neighborhood was quiet in the way older neighborhoods are, where people watch from behind curtains but still bring out their trash cans at the same time every week. On my third day, a woman from 2 houses down walked over while I was hauling a broken screen door to the curb. She had gray hair pulled into a loose clip and a canvas tote bag that looked older than my car. She introduced herself as Mrs. DeLeon and said she used to teach 4th grade. She didn't ask why I was there. She just looked at the house, then at my hands, already scraped raw from pulling nails, and she said, "This neighborhood changes in slow motion." Then she pointed at the lot lines like she'd lived with them for decades. "Most people only see the house," she added, more softly. "They forget what sits underneath it." I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't ask. At that point, I wasn't thinking about land or zoning or anything long-term. I was thinking about the roof, the wiring, the smell in the walls, and the way my sister's condo photos kept popping up on my phone, like proof of a life I wasn't allowed to have. I stood in my half-dark living room that night, listening to a steady drip into the bucket, and I felt the last of my hope finally leave. The first 6 months were pure survival. I worked my regular job in medical billing during the day, then came home and became a different kind of worker at night, the kind who measured, patched, scrubbed, and learned everything the hard way. When COVID hit in early 2020, the world shrank down to essentials, and my house became one long list of them. Hardware stores had empty shelves, lumber prices climbed like they were trying to escape the earth. Contractors stopped returning calls unless you had money, and I didn't. So I did what I'd always done in my family. I adjusted. I figured it out. I watched videos on my phone propped against a paint can. I borrowed tools from Mrs. DeLeon. I learned how to cut drywall without slicing my fingers open. I replaced a section of roof one weekend at a time, sweating through my shirt until it clung to my back. I fixed the heater the first winter by sitting on the floor with a flashlight in my mouth, reading a manual that might as well have been written in another language. The house fought me at every step. Nails bent, pipes leaked. A raccoon somehow got into the attic and made my nights sound like someone pacing above my head. And through all of it, my parents treated the place like a joke they didn't have to hear anymore. My mother would call once every few months and ask, in that bright tone, "How's your little project?" My father would send a thumbs-up emoji if I mentioned a repair. Brooke posted photos in her condo with captions about self-care and adulting. While I stood in my bathroom, ripping out rotten baseboards, trying not to gag, I didn't argue with them. I didn't ask for help. Something in me had shifted from shock into a quiet kind of resistance. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. I stopped trying to earn their approval because I realized it was a currency they only spent on Brooke. Instead, I started keeping records, not because I planned to use them against anyone, but because life had taught me that feelings get rewritten, and paper doesn't. I saved receipts in a folder. I took photos before and after every repair. I wrote down dates. I kept emails from the city about permits. I started a simple spreadsheet, the way you do when you're trying to make sense of something that refuses to be fair. By the end of 2021, the house was still imperfect, but it was no longer falling apart. The leaks stopped. The outlets worked. The walls were clean. In 2022, I planted a small garden and built a cheap little sunroom where the broken porch used to be. The first time I sat in there with a cup of coffee and sunlight on my hands, I didn't feel proud in the way people brag about. I felt something quieter. I felt like I had finally stopped begging to be chosen. By late 2021, I started noticing small changes on the street that didn't match the way my parents talked about the neighborhood. It began with a house 2 blocks over that had sat empty for years. One day, a dumpster appeared in the driveway, then a crew, then fresh siding, new windows, and a sold sign that didn't last a week. After that, it was like the street woke up in slow motion. A couple moved into the yellow bungalow across from me and planted flowers in neat rows. Someone painted their porch a bright blue that looked almost defiant against the older homes. The corner store that used to sell mostly cigarettes and lottery tickets suddenly had a chalkboard sign outside advertising cold brew and homemade muffins. I didn't think. My house is valuable now, I thought. Something is shifting, and I don't know what it means. Mrs. DeLeon noticed, too. She told me the city had been talking for years about improving the corridor, widening the road, adding better lighting, and making it safer for walking. She said it like she'd heard it all before, but her eyes kept drifting toward the property lines, toward the empty lots that people used to ignore. Around that time, I received a letter from the county about a routine reassessment. It wasn't dramatic, just official paper and numbers. But the way the value was split caught my attention. The house itself was still treated like a modest structure. The land, though, was climbing. It didn't make sense to me at first, so I did what I always did when something felt unclear. I looked it up. I went down a rabbit hole of city planning PDFs and zoning maps that made my head ache. I learned a phrase I'd never heard in my life before: grandfathered overlay. It meant the zoning wasn't new. It had been there for decades, like a hidden layer beneath the neighborhood, waiting for the right moment to matter. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Brooke. I barely told myself. Part of me didn't want to believe it, because believing it would mean admitting that they had handed me something they never understood, and that would make everything about 2019 feel even uglier. In early 2022, a man in a clean button-down shirt knocked on my door and asked if I had a moment. He said he was working with a group that was interested in the area. He didn't ask about my house. He asked about the lot. The way he said it made my stomach drop. Not from excitement, but from the sudden realization that my family might not be the only ones watching me now. I thanked him, took his card, and closed the door with my hands shaking. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the card, and I understood something I wasn't ready to say out loud. The street wasn't just changing. It was being chosen. In May of 2023, my parents asked if they could stop by and see the house. The request came dressed up as concern, like they were suddenly curious about my life, but I could hear something sharper underneath it. My mother mentioned she had been talking to a friend from church who said the area was improving. My father added that it had been a long time since they'd visited. Brooke didn't come. She was, according to my mother, busy. The day they arrived, I cleaned the way you do when you're expecting an inspection. Not a company. I wiped down counters I'd installed myself. I swept the sunroom floor. I picked a few weeds from the garden, even though it was already too hot. When my mother walked in, she didn't say hello the way most mothers do. She stepped into the living room and paused, her eyes moving across the walls, the floors, the windows, the way the light fell now that the old broken panes were gone. For a second, I almost thought she might say she was proud. Then her expression shifted. It wasn't admiration. It was a calculation. My father stayed near the doorway, hands in his pockets, like he didn't want to touch anything that might make him feel responsible. He looked at the new ceiling, the clean baseboards, the patched corners, and he nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion. My mother walked toward the sunroom and stood there, staring out at the backyard. She asked how much it cost, not how I did it, not if it was hard. Just how much, I answered vaguely, and she made a small sound in her throat like she didn't like that I wasn't giving her a number to work with. Then she turned back to me and said, in the same voice she used when she rearranged furniture without asking, "This house makes more sense for Brooke now." I actually laughed at first. It came out too sharp, because my brain couldn't process it as a serious sentence. Brooke had a condo, a new one, safe and ready, the thing they said she needed. My mother didn't smile. She kept going. She said families sometimes make adjustments. She said things needed to be balanced. She said Brooke's place felt small for her lifestyle. My father finally spoke, but he still didn't look at me. He said, "It's only fair we rebalance things." Then my mother said the part that turned my stomach cold. She said they wanted me to move out. "Not forever," she added quickly, as that softened it. "Just for now. So Brooke could move in." She said it like it was a reasonable trade. Like the last 4 years of my life were a temporary project I'd been lucky to borrow. I stood there in my own kitchen, hearing my mother talk about my home like it was a family asset she still controlled. And I realized the gift in 2019 had never been a gift at all.
If you've ever been handed a gift that came with strings, you already know how that felt.
2 days later, a rental truck showed up in front of my house like someone had scheduled my life without telling me. I was standing in the sunroom with a cup of coffee when I heard the engine rumble and the scrape of tires against the curb. For a second, my brain refused to connect it to me. Then I saw Brooke step out of the passenger side. She wore sunglasses and held her phone in her hand, already talking before she even reached the porch. My mother followed behind her, holding a clipboard as if this were a move-in day, not an eviction. Brooke didn't knock. She opened the door and walked in as if she'd always belonged there. She started pointing at walls, talking about paint colors, and asking where the best place for her sectional would be. She called the sunroom cute, like it was a feature in a listing she was considering. My father stayed outside near the truck, speaking quietly to the driver, like he couldn't bear to be inside while this happened. When Brooke stepped fully into the living room, she finally stopped. Her face shifted in a way I'd never seen before. Not anger, not jealousy. Something closer to confusion. Her eyes moved from the floor to the windows, to the corner where I'd framed a few photos. Then they landed on the folder on my kitchen counter, the one I'd placed there earlier that morning. I hadn't planned a dramatic moment. I had just woken up and felt the calm certainty of someone who has read her own paperwork. Brooke looked at the folder like it didn't belong in the story she'd been promised. My mother mistook her silence for awe. She smiled, proud, as she had just delivered Brooke the upgrade she deserved. She turned to me and said, "We're going to make this easy. You can take what you need today and come back for the rest later." She said it gently, like she was offering mercy. My father finally came inside and stood behind my mother, still avoiding my eyes. He cleared his throat and repeated the line they'd already decided would make this feel official. 48 hours. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I just asked one question, slow and even, the way you ask a clerk to confirm a policy. "How exactly are you planning to take it back?" My mother's smile faltered. She said, "We're your parents." "That's how." Brooke crossed her arms and said, "You've had your turn." And something in me finally stopped trying to be understood. I reached for the folder and opened it on the counter. Deed survey. The county reassessment notice. The zoning map with the overlay highlighted. A letter from a real estate attorney explaining, in plain language, what I owned. My father picked up the first page, and I watched his hands start to shake. My mother leaned in, reading over his shoulder, and the color drained from her face line by line. Brooke took one step closer, her confidence collapsing into panic as she realized this wasn't a house she could claim with a truck and a clipboard.
If you've ever been treated like the placeholder in your own family, you know the moment you stop asking for permission.
The folder stayed open on the counter, not like a threat, but like a table setting nobody had expected. I didn't slide it toward them. I didn't tap the pages or point to the highlights. I just let the paper do what paper does when people can't argue with it. My father read the deed first, slowly, as if the words might change if he looked away. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her mouth tightening with every line. Brooke hovered at the edge of the kitchen, watching their faces more than the documents, like she was waiting for someone to tell her this was still going to end in her favor. I explained the basics. Quietly. The way you explain something you already accepted months ago. In 2019, when they handed me the house, they believed they were giving me a liability. The structure was old. The repairs were expensive. The neighborhood had a reputation they didn't want attached to Brooke. They thought they were being strategic. But the deed they signed transferred the property to me. Not just the house, but the lot. And the lot sat inside a grandfathered overlay zone that had existed long before any of us were adults. It wasn't a new rezoning. It wasn't a special favor. It was simply something they never bothered to look up because they didn't think I was worth the effort. The county reassessment notice was on the next page. The value jump was listed in black ink, broken into land and improvements. The house was still modest. The land was the part that had changed. I told them the city had been talking for years about upgrading the corridor, and once the first few renovations started on the block, developers began circling. I didn't say it with excitement. I said it like a weather report. My mother tried to interrupt, but my father lifted his hand without thinking, a small gesture that told her to wait. That was the first time in my life I'd seen him pause. The attorney's letter was last. It explained, in plain language, that the property was mine and that any attempt to remove me would fail, because they no longer had any legal claim. It also explained something else. Months earlier, after the man with the business card knocked on my door, I'd consulted a lawyer to understand my options. I had signed a conditional agreement with a developer group, not because I wanted to hurt my family, but because I wanted to protect myself from exactly this moment. The agreement was simple. If I brought the property up to safety code, the sale could move forward. That milestone had been met. The deposit had been sitting in escrow since the agreement was signed, waiting for the final inspection. I didn't say the number at first. I didn't need to. The reality was written in the contract, and my father's eyes kept returning to it, like he couldn't accept it. My mother finally asked, in a voice that cracked around the edges, "How much?" I told her. She didn't collapse or scream. She just sat down in the nearest chair, as her body had run out of instructions. Brooke whispered, "That can't be right." But my father was still reading, and the silence in my kitchen wasn't dramatic. It was the sound of a story changing shape in real time. After that day, nothing exploded. There was no shouting match in the street, no dramatic phone calls that ended with someone slamming down a receiver. The rental truck stayed where it was, idling like an awkward guest who had shown up at the wrong address. My mother tried a few different versions of the same sentence, each one softer than the last. She said maybe we could talk privately. She said maybe we could come to an arrangement. She said Brooke had already told people she was moving. My father finally met my eyes and said, We didn't realize as if the problem had been a misunderstanding instead of a pattern. Brooke's anger came next, not loud, but sharp. She said I was being selfish. She said I always had to make things complicated. She said family shouldn't need contracts. That was when I felt the strange calm of someone who has already grieved. I told them I wasn't taking anything from Brooke. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was simply not handing over what I had legally built and protected. I told them the sale would proceed because I had signed it, because I had met the requirements, and because, for once in my life, I was choosing stability over approval. My mother asked if I could at least give Brooke the house and take the condo. She said it like she was offering fairness. But all I heard was the same old belief that my life was movable, like furniture. I said no, not angrily, just clearly. My father asked what I wanted. The question sounded almost sincere, which made it worse because it came 4 years too late. I told him I wanted space. I wanted my name on my own decisions. I wanted my home, my money, my future. To stop being treated like a family resource they could redistribute whenever Brooke felt uncomfortable. The driver stood by the truck, pretending not to listen. Brooke stood with her arms crossed, blinking fast, trying to hold on to the story where she was always the chosen one. My mother's face moved through something like grief. But it wasn't grief for me. It was grief for the control she'd lost. When they left, they didn't hug me. They didn't apologize. They just walked out quietly, still convinced I would change my mind. 2 weeks later, the developer's inspection cleared. A month after that, the sale was finalized. I watched the house one last time, not with triumph, but with a quiet kind of respect for the version of me who had survived inside it.
If you've ever had to choose between being loved and being safe, I'd love to know what you chose.
I thought the money would feel like the ending, but it didn't. The money was just math. The real ending was the silence that followed. For the first few weeks after the sale, I kept expecting my phone to ring with another demand, another guilt-soaked message, another attempt to rewrite what had happened. But my parents went quiet. Brooke went quiet, too. It wasn't peaceful at first. It was a withdrawal, like a house after a storm, when the power is out, and you realize you can finally hear your own breathing. I moved into a small place across the bay. Nothing flashy, just clean walls, working outlets, and a front door that felt like it belonged to me without negotiation. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 3 a.m. out of habit, waiting for the drip of a leak that wasn't there. I lay in the dark and realized my body had been living on alert for years. That was the part nobody warns you about. You can leave a toxic system and still carry it in your muscles. I started therapy in late 2023, not because I wanted to blame anyone, but because I wanted to understand why I had accepted scraps for so long. My therapist didn't tell me to forgive. She didn't tell me to hate them either. She asked me questions I'd never ask myself. What did love look like in your family? What did it cost you? What did you learn to call normal? The answers were uncomfortable, but they were also clarifying. I stopped checking Brooke's social media. I stopped explaining myself to relatives who only wanted a simplified version of the story. When my mother called in early 2024, her voice sounded careful, like she was testing the air. She said she missed me. She said she didn't like how things ended. She didn't apologize. She didn't mention the truck. She didn't mention the folder. She asked if we could have lunch. I told her I wasn't ready. I said it calmly. And then I said something I had never said to her before. I said, "If you want a relationship with me, it has to be one where my life isn't up for redistribution." She was quiet for a long time. And then she said she understood. I don't know if she did, but I knew I did. Sometimes healing isn't a reunion. Sometimes it's simply the moment you stop negotiating your worth. The strangest part is that I don't feel angry anymore. I feel clear. I feel safe. I feel like I finally live in a life that fits. And when I think back to that rundown house, I don't remember it as punishment. I remember it as the place where I learned the difference between being chosen and choosing myself.
If this story hit a nerve, tell me what boundary you wish you had set sooner.